I still remember the moment I decided we should all go camping, as though the idea had somehow been waiting for me to discover it. My name is Mara Watkins, and I've never been the type who thrives in the claustrophobia of cities or the monotony of routines. I love the wilderness, the feeling of raw earth under my boots, the scent of pine needles caught in crisp morning air, and the wide possibilities that nights under the stars promise. At the time, though, I couldn't have imagined that one spontaneous suggestion would nearly destroy my sense of safety. All I wanted was a getaway weekend with friends, yet I emerged from the forests of Georgia changed in ways I still struggle to articulate. When I proposed the trip, Travis Delaney was the first to jump on board. Travis and I have been close ever since a backpacking trip we took in college. He's rugged, always sporting a few days' worth of stubble and wearing a sun-bleached baseball cap that he claims brings him luck. He might come off a bit cocky, but I think it's more a shield to hide how much he actually cares. He has this way of laughing that seems to conquer any doubts, as though his confidence alone can ward off danger. I relied on that side of him so many times during our trip, perhaps too many times. Right behind him, Lillian Chang agreed, albeit more cautiously. Lillian's the kind of person whose sincerity glows in the gentle way she speaks, and the thoughtful, almost shy tilt of her head when she listens. She's an aspiring photographer, her camera often glued to her side. On hikes, she'll stop every few minutes to capture a droplet of dew on a leaf or the silhouette of a hawk perched on a branch. She's got an eye for moments that others pass by. Before we set out on our ill-fated adventure, she was giddy at the thought of photographing Georgia's famously diverse landscapes. I never imagined her lens would capture things we can't easily explain, images that still keep me up at night. Then, there was Calvin Mercer, a self-professed skeptic, academic, and unabashed museum lover. Calvin's the kind of person who'd bring a thick historical text about the Civil War to read for fun on a Saturday night. He's our anchor in reality, or so he presented himself. I suspected his interest in camping was less about sharing in my passion for the outdoors, and more about poking holes in local ghost stories. He told us that legends were cultural artifacts and psychological illusions, dismissing any talk of curses or spirits with a wave of his hand. And at first it was funny how he'd roll his eyes whenever talk drifted to the supernatural. But out in those woods, I saw that skepticism crumble in ways I never thought possible. In the end, fear lays bare everyone's defenses. Our group decided on a route that would begin at Cloudland Canyon State Park in northwest Georgia. It's a well-known location, popular for its breathtaking overlooks and dramatic canyon walls. The plan was to spend 2 nights there, soaking in the beautiful vistas, and then push a bit deeper into more remote territory near Dahlonega, a region noted for its gold rush history and rumored paranormal activity. Travis was especially eager about this second leg of the trip. He'd heard half-baked rumors of abandoned cabins and shadowy figures lurking in the woods. Lillian was excited to get pictures of the forest at dawn and maybe some shots of old Civil War sites. Calvin brushed aside any mention of legends, but he agreed to come along, probably determined to scoff at local folklore right at its source. When we arrived at Cloudland Canyon, I felt that instant thrill I always get from towering pines and the hush of a sprawling wilderness. We checked in at the visitor center, and the ranger on duty gave us the usual safety talk. Watch out for wildlife, secure your food so the bears don't intrude, stay on marked trails, etc. Nothing unusual about that. What was odd, though, was that after he finished his standard spiel, he paused, as if he wanted to add something else. He gave me a lingering look, then spoke in a softer tone, saying something about how these lands have a long history of tragedies, that a few trails up near the canyon edges have stories. But the second Travis let out a laugh, the ranger clammed up, cleared his throat, and waved us on our way. Travis's laughter can be a bit dismissive at times. I told him as much when we took our gear out of the car, but he just shrugged and said he'd rather not pay mind to superstitions. Lillian took a mental note, though. I could tell from the crease on her brow. Our first day was glorious in all the ways I hoped. We found a campsite not too far from a waterfall that roared into a cavern below. The water's mist would drift over, cooling the air. The temperature had dipped a bit because spring nights in Georgia can still carry a chill, but it was refreshing. We set up our tents in a neat semicircle, built a small fire pit with stones, and toasted the usual camping staples, hot dogs and marshmallows. Lillian snapped a few photos of us being silly, laughing with bright faces in the glow of the flames. Even Calvin, the serious one, cracked a grin when Travis attempted to juggle a few roasted marshmallows. There wasn't a hint of dread in my mind that night. I slept to the sound of the waterfall, confident that I was exactly where I belonged. But early the next morning, something peculiar happened. I woke before dawn, stirring from a dream I can't fully recall. Something about distant drums and a woman's voice calling a name that wasn't mine. The tent felt too warm, so I unzipped the flap to find the sky still cloaked in darkness. The edge of the horizon had a faint purple glow. I decided to stretch my legs and walk to the canyon overlook alone, though I kept my flashlight handy. It's not safe to wander in darkness near steep drops after all. The trail was silent, save for a soft breeze causing the leaves to dance in the trees. As I neared the overlook, that breeze turned oddly cold. A prickling sensation crept along the back of my neck. I remember shining my flashlight toward a cluster of trees because I thought I heard movement, maybe a raccoon or possum. But the light cut only through branches. All I saw were shifting shadows. Still, I felt as though someone was standing there, watching me with unblinking eyes. I stood, breath caught in my throat, scanning the darkness for movement, half scolding myself for paranoia. But no figure appeared, so I turned back to the trail. At the overlook, the first hints of dawn were rising, and for a moment, I forgot the strange feeling. The canyon glowed in a soft purple hue. The waterfall below glinted like liquid silver. It was gorgeous enough to make me forget the world. After a few minutes, I turned to head back to camp, and that's when I heard it. The distinct sound of my name carried on a whisper. I jerked around, half expecting to see Travis pranking me, but no one was there. It was too dark for me to see far, so I raised my flashlight once more, shining it into the nearby brush. Again, nothing. My heart thudded too loudly. I was suddenly very aware that I was alone, and that I had ventured out without telling anyone. My name came again, so faint I almost doubted my own ears. Something in my gut told me not to linger, so I hurried back to our campsite, nearly stumbling over my own feet, flashlight bouncing beams off the trees. I arrived breathless, mind swirling with confusion. I decided not to wake the others. Instead, I crawled into my sleeping bag, trying to dismiss it as a trick of my imagination. A few hours later, we all woke and resumed a normal routine, cooking breakfast, sipping coffee, planning our morning hike deeper into the park. The chatter felt cheerful. Lillian was excited to trek near the canyon floor and photograph the waterfalls from below. Travis teased Calvin for wearing brand new hiking boots, calling them model boots, because they still had that pristine glow. For a while, I felt my fear from the dawn was a mere figment, a weird leftover from some dream. But when we started hiking, I noticed Lillian drifting back to walk beside me. She looked uneasy. After a moment, she said, "Did you hear anything weird last night?" She told me that she'd woken in the dark to a rustling sound outside her tent, followed by what she swore was someone or something calling her name. She wanted to believe it was me or Travis just messing around, but she said the voice was too quiet and somehow off. When she peeked out, nothing was there, only the lingering shape of a shadow that darted away too quickly to be a normal person. I lied and told her I hadn't heard anything, not wanting to alarm her. A tight coil of dread twisted in my stomach, though. The fact that we both heard our names in the night, as though the forest was trying to call us, it made me uneasy. Still, we pressed on, determined not to spoil the mood. By midday, we found the canyon floor, a gorgeous scene of mossy rocks and cascading water. Lillian took a flurry of photographs while Calvin read aloud some historical notes from a park pamphlet, droning on about how the area had once been part of Cherokee land before forced displacement. At some point, Travis joked, "Maybe the Cherokee are haunting us." Calvin shot back that it was statistically improbable. I glanced at Lillian, who just frowned at the ground. It was an odd moment, filled with tension I couldn't put my finger on. We finished our 2 nights in Cloudland Canyon without further disturbances, though I felt uneasy whenever night fell, as though the darkness was thicker there. On the second night, Travis claimed he saw a strange shape creeping around behind the trees near our fire, but he dismissed it as a stray dog or raccoon. Lillian and I locked eyes then, neither one quite believing that explanation, but neither willing to make a fuss. We slept fitfully, the wind occasionally howling through the canyon walls like a distorted voice. By dawn, I couldn't shake the idea that we needed a change of scenery, so I suggested heading to Dahlonega earlier than planned. I didn't voice that I was starting to feel watched in Cloudland Canyon. The official reason was that we wanted more time to explore a wilder forest. Travis readily agreed, excited by the prospect of a quieter, less touristy location. Driving east toward Dahlonega, We passed rolling hills and farmland, the roads eventually winding into denser woodlands. The conversation in the car was light at first, with Travis telling jokes about how we'd scare each other with ghost stories around the next campfire. Lillian occasionally chimed in, though she was more subdued. Calvin was fascinated by the gold rush history, rattling off facts about how Dahlonega was the site of the first major gold rush in the United States. He kept saying, "People died over the smallest flecks of gold, you know," which I found oddly morbid. We stopped in the actual town of Dahlonega for supplies, food, a new lantern, and extra rope. We also asked the store clerk about good camping spots. She gave us a strange look when we mentioned we wanted something remote, then recommended a patch of forest about 15 miles away. She said, "It's deep though. Not many folks go that way. The roads aren't well maintained." And like the ranger in Cloudland Canyon, she hesitated as if she wanted to add something else, but ended up telling us to be safe instead. The roads were indeed rough, and eventually we had to park the car near a gravel clearing and hoof it the rest of the way with our packs. The forest here felt different. The trees, mostly pines and hardwoods, were tall and old, their branches forming a thick canopy that filtered the sunlight. It was eerily quiet too. No rustling squirrels, no chirping birds, not even the hum of insects at first. It was as if we'd stepped into a place where the usual background noise of nature had abandoned us. We found a serviceable clearing near a creek. The water was murky, running slow, and had a slight metallic odor. It might have been runoff from old mining sites, I reasoned. We pitched our tents, set up a makeshift fire pit with stones, and got ourselves settled. By that time, the sun was already dipping lower. Once darkness fell, I found myself on edge again. We lit a fire and cooked a modest meal, but the atmosphere felt heavy. Lillian was fiddling with her camera, flipping through photos from Cloudland Canyon, and that's when she said, "Oh my God," in a hushed, shaky voice. She turned the camera's display around to show me a photo she'd taken from the canyon floor. At a glance, it looked normal, a shot of the waterfall in the distance, but if you squinted at the shadowed area near the rock face, there was a faint, elongated shape, humanoid but distorted, as though leaning out from behind the rocks, with glints of light that could be eyes. It might have been a trick of the light, or a stretch of the imagination, but it made my stomach lurch. Calvin insisted it was just a play of shadows. Travis looked at it with a frown. He didn't laugh, and that unsettled me more than anything, seeing him so serious. He took a swig of water, glanced around the perimeter of our camp, and then muttered something about wild illusions. We tried to brush it off, but the uneasy feeling lingered. That night, I volunteered for first watch, not because we had any real reason for a watch, but because we joked about being extra safe. The forest around us was dense, and the flickering firelight made our shadows jump in the trees. Now and then, I would hear a soft crack of a branch or the swish of leaves, only to see nothing when I turned. Eventually, after maybe 2 hours, I woke Travis to take the second watch. My sleep was restless. Dreams of that shape from Lillian's photo tugged at my mind. Only in the dream it was right behind me, whispering words I couldn't understand. Once, I jolted awake, convinced I heard chanting, but each time the darkness of the tent offered only silence. Morning brought a sense of relief. Golden light filtered through the canopy and birds finally broke their silence, singing a scattered chorus. Travis seemed edgy though. While we prepared to hike deeper into the forest to find some rumored old mining ruins, he pulled me aside. He told me that in the middle of his watch, the compass he always carried had started spinning, as though it couldn't find north. I tried to make sense of it. Magnetic minerals in the ground, some anomaly, but the way he described it gave me chills. He said, it wasn't random spinning, it was shaking, like it was resisting something. On top of that, he thought he saw footprints around the edge of our camp when he wandered a bit with his flashlight. They were large, barefoot prints with disturbingly long strides that disappeared into the undergrowth. He'd tried to follow them, but they vanished abruptly as though whoever made them simply evaporated. We headed toward an abandoned trail, marked only by a faint footpath and overgrown shrubs. Lillian, camera around her neck, snapped a few pictures of the bizarre carvings we found on trees and rocks along the way. Some looked vaguely like Native American symbols. Others resembled scratch marks, deep gouges that no normal human could have made. At one point, we even found a cluster of bizarre twig formations hanging from branches, like small effigies. Calvin insisted these were just leftover jokes from passing hikers, or maybe some misguided attempts at Blair Witch-style pranks. Yet his voice betrayed a hint of unease. The day's hike led us to a dilapidated wooden shack near a crumbling mineshaft entrance. The air there felt stale, even though a breeze rustled the leaves overhead. Stepping inside, we found an old table, a rusted lantern, and what might have been ancient mining equipment. Lillian was quietly snapping photos, more out of habit than enthusiasm. She didn't look like she wanted to linger. Neither did I. Something about that shack set every nerve on edge. There was this persistent sense that we were trespassing in a domain that wasn't meant for us. Still, Travis forced a grin, examining the rotted walls, muttering about how old ghosts weren't going to scare him. I tried to share in his bravado, but a fleeting movement at the corner of my eye stopped me. I turned, catching a glimpse of that same tall shape I'd thought I saw in Cloudland Canyon. It was gone as soon as my head moved, like a flicker of darkness that retreated into the tree line. My heart pounded in my chest. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw the shape turn, revealing limbs that bent at unnatural angles. Fear spiked in me, but I didn't want to shout and alarm everyone over something I couldn't confirm. Instead, I just stared at the tree line, feeling certain we were being watched. By the time we trudged back to camp, the sun was already dipping behind the pines, bathing the woods in an amber glow. Calvin was the first to notice that our campsite had been disturbed. The tents were still there, but the flaps were open, and some of our supplies had been scattered. A sense of violation rippled through us. Travis cursed under his breath and started checking for missing items. We found that some of our food was gone, and the rope we'd left coiled near the fire pit was unspooled and dragged out into the bushes. There was no sign of a bear or any typical animal rummaging. Instead, in the center of the clearing, we discovered a bizarre arrangement of small bones and twigs, tied together with what looked like strands of cloth, maybe from our own gear. It was shaped into a crude figure, almost human, with a head, arms, and legs, but it was twisted in such a way that made my stomach knot. Lillian looked close to tears. Travis tried to reassure us it was likely the work of some local prankster. Yet the tracks around the clearing looked more like those massive footprints he'd described from the night before. The very sight of them made me feel ill. That night, fear weighed down on us heavily. We huddled around the fire, speaking in hushed tones. No one ate much. Calvin's skepticism was melting away. He kept glancing into the darkness as if expecting some monster to burst forth. We talked about whether to leave first thing in the morning. Travis argued that we should stay, that leaving in a panic would mean letting some prankster get to us. I wasn't so sure it was just a prankster. When the conversation drifted to local Cherokee legends and the idea of malevolent spirits or skinwalkers, Calvin fell silent, rubbing his temples as though he had a headache. Lillian said she had heard tales about shapeshifters that guard certain cursed lands. She'd read about them for a folklore class in college. Travis rolled his eyes, but not with as much conviction as before. I asked if any of us had phone service to maybe look up local legends, but our phones were basically useless. Mine showed no service. Travis's GPS device wouldn't even power on. We were disconnected from the outside world, enveloped in a silent, brooding forest. Later, just as we were about to settle in, Travis rummaged through his pack, producing a small notebook file he kept on local ghost stories. He liked collecting them. While flipping through, he found references to a rumored witch coven that once took refuge in these parts during the 1800s. Supposedly, they performed sacrilegious rites near old mining sites, luring travelers away from main roads and offering them in bizarre rituals. It wasn't a story I'd ever heard, and it might have been purely fictional, but when he described it, my skin crawled. Then he found a section about a malevolent guardian spirit rumored to roam the forests of North Georgia. The text said it could appear as a wounded deer, or a lost child, or a monstrous silhouette, always using illusions to trap its victims. Hearing this, Calvin scoffed. These are just tall tales people made up to scare off trespassers. But Lillian, wide-eyed, flipped her camera's display back to that ominous shape at the waterfall. A hush settled. Travis slammed the notebook shut, looking rattled. We tried to fortify the camp by dragging some larger logs around our tents and keeping our fire bigger than usual. But the night was an exercise in dread. Every rustle of leaves felt amplified. At some point, Lillian and I shared a watch. She kept her camera poised, trying to catch any evidence of movement. The moon was bright enough to cast shifting shadows through the trees. That was almost worse than total darkness because we'd see shapes that might be illusions, or might not be illusions at all. Twice I thought I saw a tall figure standing behind a tree, but whenever I blinked or turned, it was gone. Lillian was trembling, and I could feel her tension vibrating through the air. After a few hours of this, we woke Calvin to replace us. He looked none too happy, but he grabbed his flashlight and took a seat by the fire. When dawn finally arrived, the immediate sense of danger receded, but we found fresh markings around our campsite. This time, a cluster of symbols had been scratched into the dirt near the creek. They looked like circles intersected by lines, and some swirl patterns reminiscent of Celtic knots, but not quite. I have no idea how to describe them properly, except that their placement felt deliberate. Calvin knelt to examine them, and his face went pale. He said, "I saw these in a museum exhibit once, near sketches of old Cherokee or southeastern tribal patterns, but these look twisted." Travis said something about, "We need to figure out who's screwing with us." Lillian just stared at the patterns, snapping pictures from multiple angles, her breath hitching. By now, the tension within the group was palpable. Every time we tried to have a rational conversation, someone's voice would waver, or we'd hear a branch snap in the distance and freeze. I suggested that we pack up and get the hell out, but Travis argued we should stand our ground. He refused to be chased off by some unknown presence. Lillian was torn. She didn't want to appear weak, but I could sense she wanted to leave. Calvin, for once, was unnervingly quiet. He didn't put up any fight about leaving. In fact, he looked like he would sprint down the trail if I said the word. We eventually decided to stay until we got more clarity, or until something truly dangerous forced our hand. It was a group compromise that left me uneasy. We spent the day searching for any sign of other campers or tracks leading to a main road, but the deeper we went, the more labyrinthine the forest seemed. At times, we stumbled upon random bits of old wood that might have been part of another collapsed shack or a broken fence. Occasionally, Travis's compass would spin wildly before settling again. Around midday, the breeze picked up, carrying a haunting quality to it, like voices carried on the wind. More than once, I thought I heard distant cries or even a child's laughter. Every time I mentioned it, Calvin's face would twitch, as though he heard it too, but refused to admit it. As dusk fell, we returned to camp in defeated silence, having found no help, no other hikers, no roads. We had a quiet dinner of canned soup. The atmosphere was suffocating. Then, as if our collective nerves weren't frayed enough, we discovered fresh claw marks on one of the trees bordering our clearing. They were at least 7 feet off the ground, parallel gashes that cut deep into the bark. I placed my hand near them for scale, and they dwarfed my palm. Whatever made them had to have freakish reach or height. Lillian snapped pictures, her hands shaking so badly that most shots came out blurry. Travis was silent for a long moment, staring at the deep grooves like they were a personal threat. Then he muttered, "Okay, I'm done being polite," and he took out a flare gun he'd packed for emergencies. That was a sobering moment for me. I'd always thought of Travis as so confident. The fact he felt the need to brandish the flare gun told me he was deeply afraid. Night crept in. It was our third night out here, and though it was actually less time than we planned, it felt like an eternity. We built the biggest fire we could manage, the flames roaring high, illuminating the trees. Lillian set her camera on a makeshift tripod, hoping to document anything that approached. We tried to form a plan. In the event something or someone threatened us outright, we'd make as much noise as possible. Fire the flare gun, scream, do whatever. Then, as soon as the threat retreated, we'd grab our packs and flee. No more half measures. Calvin urged us to leave right then, but traveling at night with minimal light in these labyrinthine woods felt like a suicidal move. If we got lost or fell into a ravine, it could be worse. We sat around the fire, anxiously waiting, listening. The wind sighed through the pines. The occasional crackle of the fire felt almost deafening in the silence. A few times, Lillian tried to say something, but the words died on her lips. Travis tapped his foot relentlessly against a rock. Calvin stared at the flames like they held the only warmth left in the world. A half hour passed, then an hour. Then, without warning, we heard something. A scraping sound like branches being dragged across the ground. It came from the north side of camp, beyond the line of trees. We all stood, adrenaline slamming into our veins. Lillian grabbed her camera, turned it toward the sound, and snapped a photo. The flash illuminated the dark for a split second. In that flash, I caught sight of movement, a hunched figure that retreated so fast it seemed inhuman. My heart hammered. Travis aimed the flare gun, but it was gone before he could fire. The scraping continued intermittently, circling our camp, sometimes closer, sometimes farther. We'd whirl around each time, trying to spot it. The tension was maddening. Lillian snapped photos in multiple directions, trying to catch it in the flash. We saw fleeting glimpses. A tall, gaunt shape with elongated limbs, eyes that reflected the firelight in a dull glow. At one point, it almost seemed to stand upright on two legs, then drop to all fours in a sickening twist. My breath came in ragged gasps. "This can't be real," Calvin whispered. But there it was, unmistakable. We heard a growl, low and guttural, that vibrated in my chest. Then a sound like something scraping bark, or maybe those claws on a tree trunk. Suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it approach the edge of the firelight. It was maybe 20 feet away, half obscured by a trunk. Travis didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger on the flare gun. The flare streaked across the clearing in a bright arc, lighting the trees in a harsh glare. We got a direct look at the creature. For a second, I felt my knees buckle. It was shaped like a tall, emaciated man, but its arms were too long, its head tilted at a bizarre angle, the mouth parted in a silent snarl. The color of its skin was a mottled gray, like rotting bark. Its eyes were two pinpoints of reflective light, locked on us with a terrifying intelligence. As the flare hissed past it, the creature let out a shriek that pierced my ears and rattled my bones. Lillian screamed, stumbling backward. Calvin yelled something incoherent. Travis tried to reload the flare gun, hands shaking. The creature vanished into the shadows beyond our ring of fire, moving faster than I've ever seen anything move. A sense of sheer panic seized me. "We have to go now," I shouted, though my voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. Travis argued for a split second. He wanted to stand his ground, but we all saw how quickly that thing moved, how it seemed to melt into darkness. No matter how big our fire was, it could approach from any angle, at any moment. Lillian was already half-packing her bag in frantic jerks. Calvin grabbed his flashlight, muttering that we needed to run. Travis looked torn, but an inhuman screech from beyond the trees snapped him out of his bravado. He hissed, "All right, let's move." We started throwing essentials into our packs. The forest around us erupted with strange echoes, like multiple voices layered over each other, some crying, some chanting. It sounded like a chorus of lost souls. My hands shook so badly I dropped my canteen twice. We abandoned the tents, leaving them standing, stuffing only food, water, and first aid kits into our bags. Lillian was so frantic she didn't even fold her tripod, just wrenched the camera off and let the metal stand fall to the dirt. Calvin tried to pocket the memory card, muttering that we might need proof. In the flickering glow of the dying fire, shadows seemed to pulse around us. Then we ran. The only thing on my mind was that we needed to find the main trail, or a road or something that would lead us back to civilization. Travis led the way, using a headlamp. Lillian was behind him, occasionally spinning around with her flashlight, terrified that the creature was on our heels. Calvin clutched his side, struggling to keep up, and I tried to bring up the rear, shining my flashlight into the trees. The sound of snapping branches followed us, but it was impossible to pinpoint direction in the darkness. At one point, we reached a slope that we tumbled down, branches scratching our arms and faces. We didn't stop. Adrenaline numbed the pain. We stumbled onward for what felt like hours. The forest seemed endless, twisting trails weaving in circles. Fog seeped in, swirling around our legs. My lungs burned from exertion. My thoughts jumbled with fear. I kept expecting the creature to jump out from behind a tree, but we never got another clear look, only occasional glimpses of movement in our peripheral vision, or the soft hiss of something gliding between bushes. Eventually the slope leveled out, and we noticed the faint outline of a path that must have been used by hikers long ago. It was overgrown but slightly more open. We took it, hoping it led somewhere safer. Then the wind carried a new smell, smoke, like wood smoke from a chimney. We pushed forward, hearts pounding with a flicker of hope. After maybe another 15 minutes of trudging, we emerged onto a gravel road near a dilapidated sign that read, "County maintenance ends here." Exhausted beyond words, we looked at each other in disbelief. Lillian, tears streaking her dusty cheeks, let out a half-choked laugh. We had reached the outskirts of civilization, or close to it. Without speaking, we followed the gravel until it became a paved road. Night was still thick, but we could see stars overhead and the silhouette of an occasional house in the distance. We paused only to catch our breath, pressing on until we reached the edge of a small residential area. Eventually, we stumbled into Dahlonega proper, or at least a rural part of the county near the main town. The few lights we saw were from houses spaced far apart. We probably looked like hell, torn clothes, wild eyes, covered in dirt. We didn't even know what time it was by then, but a glowing porch light on a ranch house was the most welcoming sight I'd ever seen. Travis wanted to knock and ask for help, but we were all a bit terrified of how insane our story would sound. Instead, we used Lillian's phone, which finally got a bar or two of service, to call for a local taxi to pick us up. When the driver arrived, We must have looked like refugees from a war. He didn't ask many questions, just raised his eyebrows at our gear and scratched faces. I suspect he'd seen plenty of spooked hikers in these parts. We rode back into Dahloneg's small downtown in near silence. I stared out the window, expecting to see that elongated figure bounding behind us in the moonlight, but it didn't appear. That intangible dread, however, lingered in my bones. At a cheap motel, we got 2 rooms and crashed for what remained of the night. None of us slept well. Lillian kept her camera pressed to her chest like a talisman. Travis slept fitfully, waking to any hint of noise from outside. Calvin didn't speak much. I lay awake, my thoughts racing between relief at being out of those woods and a gnawing guilt that I had suggested this trip in the first place. In the morning, we stumbled to a diner in town, trying to compose ourselves. The smell of coffee and fried eggs should have been comforting, but all I could think about was that shriek echoing in my head. We formed an unspoken pact not to say too much to the locals about what happened, for fear of being ridiculed. When a friendly waitress asked where we'd come from, Travis mumbled something about too deep in the forest and left it at that. I'm sure the townspeople were used to hearing tall tales, but we weren't ready to share ours. It felt too raw, too unsettling. After breakfast, Lillian and Calvin checked the photos on her camera more thoroughly. Most were either normal nature shots or long exposure images showing swirling branches, but a few had captured half glimpses of that shape in the darkness. In one shot, we could see a suggestion of a gaunt limb snaking behind a tree. Another photo, taken at the moment Travis fired the flare, was blurred, but the blur formed a skeletal silhouette with 2 pinpoint eyes glowing. Calvin muttered something like, "This has to be a trick of the light," but his voice held no conviction. Lillian shook her head, close to tears. She said, "I'd delete them all if I wasn't afraid of losing my mind." We collectively decided to keep them for now. As horrifying as they were, they felt like the only proof that we weren't all losing our grip on reality. We parted ways from Dahlonega quickly, piling into my car and driving southwest. The plan was to pass through more populated areas, eventually heading home to Atlanta, but something lingered in me, a need to see the Okefenokee swamp that had once been on our itinerary. It was a bizarre urge, maybe a twisted compulsion to confront the wide array of Georgia's landscapes. Yet none of us truly had the energy or the will to step back into any form of wilderness. We decided collectively that Okefenokee would have to remain unexplored for now. By the time we reached Atlanta, we were physically safe, but emotionally raw. We each retreated to our own lives, though we texted and called each other frequently in the weeks that followed. I had nightmares, nights where I'd bolt awake, ears ringing with that same shriek, or the hush of my name called by an unseen presence. Lillian confided that sometimes in the quiet of her apartment, she'd hear that scraping sound just outside her window, though there was nothing there when she looked. Calvin, once so outspoken against superstition, refused to discuss the matter in depth. He'd often change the subject with a trembling hand, turning pale at the mere mention of the trip. Travis tried to maintain a facade of normalcy, returning to his usual jokes whenever we met in person. But one night, after a few drinks, he confessed that he kept replaying the moment he saw that creature's face, or what passed for its face. "It wasn't just an animal, Mara," he said quietly. "It looked wrong, like it knew we were trespassing." Months passed. We never did find the right words to explain to others what we'd experienced. The gear we left behind presumably rotted out in that lost patch of forest, or was taken by whoever or whatever else roams there. Lillian still has the photos, buried deep in a folder on her laptop. Occasionally, curiosity drives me to ask her about them, but she usually waves me off, saying she can't bear to look. Calvin's nightmares got so bad he started seeing a counselor. He never mentions statistical improbabilities anymore. Travis claimed he was going back for a while, that he wanted answers, but whenever the topic comes up, he just forces a half smile and changes the subject. In truth, I don't think he ever will go back. Neither will I. Yet for reasons I can't fully rationalize, I returned to Cloudland Canyon a few months later, just for a quick daytime visit with some coworkers who knew nothing about what happened. The canyon was as gorgeous as ever, sunlight gleaming on the rocks and the waterfall sparkling below. Tourists in bright-colored clothes snapped pictures. Children ran around squealing with delight. As I walked near the overlook, I felt a chill breeze. Just like that morning I first heard my name whispered. A hush fell around me. In the distance, near the tree line, I thought I saw the shape of a tall figure. I stared, my heart pounding, but families chatted around me, oblivious to my panic. The shape melted away as if it was never there. A swirl of leaves blew across the path, and the moment was gone. Was it my imagination? Or was I being reminded that some part of that presence remained connected to me? I don't know what exactly we encountered in the forest near Dalanega. Maybe it was a spirit born from centuries of violence, a guardian of scars that can't be healed. Maybe it was a shapeshifter sustained by the land's darkest traumas. Or perhaps it was something else entirely, an evil older than any legend. But I do know it was real. We all felt it, heard it, saw it. If it chose to spare us by letting us flee, or if we simply outran it, I'll never know. But my nightmares suggest that I haven't truly escaped. Even in the safety of my urban apartment, sometimes I'll hear the faintest scratch at my window, or the echo of a growl in the hum of traffic. In those moments, I remember that place, those dark trees, and the silent watchers that lurk just beyond the boundaries of normal sight. I keep telling myself I'll never go camping again, not in any part of Georgia or anywhere else. Yet there's a strange pull in me, a primal curiosity that wants to understand what secrets the wilderness holds. It's a battle between the wonder I've always felt for nature and the terror of what I now know can lurk there. Maybe one day I'll find the courage to face it again, or maybe that would be pure folly. I can't decide which part of me is stronger, the part that wants to conquer my fear, or the part that wants to bury it. My final word of caution is this. If you ever find yourself lured by Georgia's scenic beauty and the promise of camping under the stars, do so with reverence. There are places there where the air runs cold, where illusions of the past remain far too tangible. If you sense the forest calling your name, turn away before you see the true face of what lies hidden among those ancient trees. If you don't, you might find yourself like me, haunted by a presence that never really leaves, forever tied to the land's dark echoes. And believe me, that is no way to live.